Welcome to Libyth. In the spring of 1689, a man left the city of Edo on foot. He was 45 years old, which in the Japan of his time was already a considerable age, already past what many would consider the midpoint of a life. He carried very little. He wore a traveler's cloak and a bamboo hat. He had a small bag, some ink, some paper. He had no certainty that he would return. He had, in fact, written farewell poems before departing, as was the custom for those who did not expect to come back, as if the road north was already a kind of dying. His friends came to see him off at the river crossing. Some of them walked with him for a few miles before turning back. And then the city fell away behind him, and the road opened ahead, and Matsuo Bashō walked into what would become one of the most celebrated journeys in the history of world literature. What he produced over the 5 months that followed, roughly 2,400 kilometers on foot through the mountains and valleys and coasts of northern Japan, became what one writer would later call the soul of Japan itself. Not the record of a journey, not a diary. Something harder to name than either of those things. Something that sits at the edge of what prose can do and what poetry can do, and refuses to belong entirely to either. The text is called Oku no Hosomichi, which translates roughly as the narrow road to the deep north, and it is the book we are going to spend this series exploring together. We are going to move through it slowly and carefully. Its world, its form, its figures, its philosophy, its themes, because it rewards that kind of attention the way few texts in any literary tradition do. To understand why this text matters, you need to understand who Basho already was when he left. He was not a young man searching for a subject. By 1689, he was already famous, already revered. His school of haiku, the shaman, had students across Japan, and his influence on the 17-syllable form had been transformative. The particular mode he had developed, quiet, spare, piercing, attuned to the exact weight of a single natural moment, had changed what the form could do. He had already written what would become arguably the most famous poem in the Japanese language, The Old Pond, a frog jumping in, the sound of water. That poem existed years before this journey. He was not searching for his voice. He had it. He had built a school around it, and a reputation that extended across the archipelago. What he was searching for was something else, something the city and the school and the reputation could not give him, something that required the road and the absence and the exposure to everything that the road and the absence and the exposure bring. There is a passage near the opening of Oku no Hosomichi in which Basho describes the months before his departure. He says that something like a wind spirit had taken possession of him, that he could not settle, that even the sight of someone preparing for a journey made him restless, that the road called him the way an addiction calls. This is more than literary convention, though it draws on convention. The wandering poet is a figure with deep roots in both Japanese and Chinese literary culture, and Basho was literate in the conventions and deployed them deliberately. What makes this particular description feel true rather than performed is what comes after. The admission that he was not sure why he was going, that the north, the deep north, the Oku of the title, was not just a geographical destination, but something like a psychological necessity. A place where the self might finally encounter something larger than itself and be changed by the encounter. The north he was heading toward was not entirely known territory, but it was not entirely unknown either. The provinces of the northeast, collectively called Michinoku or Oku, had been the subject of Japanese poetry and legend for centuries. They were associated with remoteness, with hardship, with a wildness that the cultural center in Kyoto had always regarded with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some of the most famous poetic sites in Japan were there, places that had accumulated centuries of literary meaning, places that every poet who read classical Japanese poetry knew by name and association, even if they had never visited. Basho was going to these places deliberately as a pilgrimage, and he was also going beyond them, into territory less frequently visited, into the actual wilderness of the interior, the mountain passes and the Japan sea coast, and the remote temples clinging to rock faces in the mountains of the northeast. The danger of the journey was real and not simply rhetorical. The roads were not safe in any modern sense. Bandits were a genuine risk in the mountain passes, particularly for a traveler carrying goods or money. The inns were variable in quality and sometimes non-existent, meaning that travelers had to negotiate shelter as they went. Disease was a constant threat. Basho was in indifferent health throughout the journey, and at various points seems to have been genuinely ill. And the sheer physical demand of walking 2,400 kilometers over the course of 5 months, through mountain terrain, in weather that ranged from the heat of summer to the cold of early autumn in the hills, was enormous. Basho was not a young athlete. He was a middle-aged poet with a history of illness and a body accustomed to the relative comforts of city life and the patronage of his students. The physical ordeal of the journey is present in the text, not dramatized, not complained about at length, but there, in the way the body's limits are always there, shaping what can be done and what cannot. The form he chose for the resulting text was haibun, a hybrid form that weaves prose with haiku in a sequence where neither element is simply illustrating or explaining the other. The prose sections are written in a dense, elusive style, drawing on classical Chinese as well as Japanese literary precedent, creating a texture that is compressed in a different way from the poems, but equally resistant to paraphrase. A prose passage will establish a moment, a location, a quality of light or weather or feeling, and it will circle towards something without quite arriving. Then the haiku arrives, and instead of landing where the prose seemed to be heading, it lands somewhere else, on a single image, a single sound, a single perception that reframes everything that came before it. The gap between the end of the prose and the beginning of the poem is not a pause. It is an active space, a place where meaning is made by the reader rather than delivered by the text. Learning to read oku, no Hosomichi, means learning to inhabit those gaps, to let the space between prose and poem do its work without rushing to close it with interpretation. Kenji Miyazawa, one of Japan's most beloved writers of the 20th century, a poet and storyteller whose own work was saturated in the natural world of the Northeast, the very landscape Basho moved through, once said of this text that it was as if the very soul of Japan had written it. That is an enormous claim, and it is worth pausing on what it might mean, not as hyperbole, but as a genuine attempt to name something. Not simply that the text is very Japanese, though it is saturated in Japanese aesthetics and Zen sensibility, and the particular relationship to landscape that shaped the culture for centuries. What Miyazawa seems to be pointing at is something more fundamental. That Oku no Hosomichi arrived at something real about the nature of existence, about the relationship between the human and the world, between beauty and loss, between the desire to hold on and the necessity of letting go, and that it arrived at it in a form so perfectly suited to its content that the two became inseparable. The Soul of Japan wrote it not because the text is patriotic or nationalist in any modern sense, but because it expressed, with extraordinary precision and in the most concentrated literary form available, the deepest concerns of a civilization that had spent centuries thinking about impermanence, about the sacred quality of the natural world, about what it means to be a human being in a world that is beautiful and passing. Basho himself gave us perhaps the most essential key to the text in a single sentence, a sentence that has since become one of the most quoted in Japanese literature. Every day is a journey, and the journey itself home. This is not a metaphor layered on top of the travel. It is the argument. The road is not a means to a destination. The movement is not in service of arrival. The journey is home in the sense that home is not a place, but a mode of being, attentive, present, stripped of the accumulations that make us heavy, stripped of the routines and certainties that insulate us from the full reality of the world we are moving through. To be on the road is to be in the condition most suited to seeing clearly, to meeting the world as it actually is rather than as we need it to be. Basho is not going somewhere. He is practicing a way of being, and the way of being is the destination, and every day on the road is an instance of what he is trying to teach himself. What gave Basho the philosophical equipment for this kind of thinking was in part the Chinese poet Du Fu, who stands behind Oku no Hosomichi the way a teacher stands behind a student, invisible in the text but structuring everything. Du Fu was a Tang dynasty poet of the 8th century, and Basho revered him with an intensity that shaped his entire aesthetic sensibility. Du Fu wrote from within catastrophe, from within the collapse of the Tang court, from within exile and displacement and poverty, from within the ruins of a civilization he had loved and served. What he found in that position was a way of writing that held grief and beauty together without resolving the tension between them, that looked at what was lost and made of the looking itself a form of fidelity to what had existed. The flowers bloom in the capital, though the capital is burning. The birds sing, though the empire is falling apart. Du Fu does not look away, and his refusal to look away, his insistence on seeing both the beauty and the destruction simultaneously, on bearing witness without the comfort of resolution, is the mode Basho inherits. Basho encountered Du Fu's work through the deep Chinese literary education that formed the basis of any serious Japanese intellectual formation in his period. Classical Chinese was the language of scholarship, of official life, of Buddhist texts, and of the continental literary tradition that Japanese writers had engaged with and learned from for centuries. Du Fu, in particular, occupied an almost sacred position in that tradition. He was considered the greatest of the Tang poets, a moral witness as much as a literary figure, a man whose suffering had been transformed into art of permanent value. That human civilization is a project conducted within the patience of the world, and that the world will outlast the project without animosity, without even indifference in any personal sense, simply by being what it is. In this series, we are going to move through this text with care, and with a commitment to taking it seriously as the intellectual and philosophical achievement it is. We will begin with the world Basho walked through, the Edo Japan of the late 17th century, its power structures, its rigid hierarchies, its extraordinary achievement of social control, and the internal pressures that control generated. We will then look at the architecture of the text itself, at how it is built, at what the haibun form is doing, and why the incompleteness of the text is not a failure, but its most honest gesture. We will look at who appears in the text, the figures, the companions, the historical ghosts, the mountains and rivers and storms that function almost as characters in their own right. We will look at what the text is about underneath, what it appears to be about, at the Buddhist and Taoist and Shinto layers that run beneath the surface of the journey. And we will look at the great themes, at impermanence and solitude, at nature as a sacred presence, at the poetic pilgrimage as a form of spiritual practice, and at what it means that every civilization eventually becomes grass. There is a reason this text, written over 3 centuries ago, in a form that requires patience to enter, about a journey through a Japan that no longer exists, continues to be read, continues to move people, continues to inspire travelers who retrace the route even now with the text in hand. It is not nostalgia, and it is not cultural loyalty, and it is not simply the prestige of the canon. It is because Basho was asking questions that do not age, because he was asking them with extraordinary precision and formal intelligence, and because the form he found for the asking, 17 syllables, a gap, a prose passage circling a moment it cannot name, another gap, another 17 syllables, is capable of producing in the reader an experience that no other form quite replicates. The experience of being briefly present, briefly attentive, briefly in contact with the world as it actually is. The experience of holding something beautiful in full awareness of its passing. The experience of being, for a moment, on the road, with the city falling away behind you and the deep north opening ahead. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.